Dear listeners, welcome to another episode of Podcast Evropy. We are happy to be back because the holidays are coming to over, but we have one special guest for you, not only one, but don't worry. And today's guest is Professor Morten Rasmussen from Copenhagen University. Morten, thank you for accepting our invitation.
Thank you for hosting. It's a pleasure to be here and an honor.
Today we'll be talking about the beginning of European integration, or not. We are not going to talk about coal and steel, but we will touch it as well. So probably the most important community of all of them is the European Economic Community, which began in its existence in 50s. And how that happened? Because was there anything before the EEC treaty?
Of course, there were a lot of things before the EEC treaty. That's a very difficult question to answer in any kind of short manner. Because you can say, I think after the Second World War, there were, particularly in continental Europe, Western continental states, since we, from 1948, have the Cold War. In these states, there were very strong popular movements in support of European federalism. And this was something that both came out of many of the resistance movements in Europe, that they wanted to create a different sort of Europe that would not relapse into another world war. And federalism, European federalism, the idea that you could have a European parliament with direct elected, maybe a European government that would create some sort of basic common market in Europe and could then be a stalwart against the re-emergence of nationalism and extremism and solve those security dilemmas that really had haunted Europe since the late 19th century. So those kind of movements were there in the immediate post-war years. They very much influenced particularly the new Christian democratic parties that became very prominent in continental Europe. Of the 6 states, the Benelux countries, Italy, West Germany, and France, that negotiated the Treaty of Paris that set up the European Coal and Steel Community in 1952. The Treaty of Paris is from 1951. Those 6 countries were led by Christian democratic governments when they negotiated that treaty. So therefore, you can say European federalism actually did play a very significant role in the 1940s and early 1950s. However, I think for many European federalists, the idea was that you would take a much bigger step than Europe has ever taken, actually, because their plans didn't really pan out. Already when the Council of Europe was set up in the immediate post-war years, you would see attempts to hijack the Council of Europe, which did not only have the continental European countries, but also Britain and the Scandinavian countries. And what happened was really that basically the assembly of the Council of Europe in 1948, 1949, they tried to become a constituent body. They wanted a direct election to confirm their legitimacy. Then they wanted to create a federal European constitution. But the governments vetoed this attempt. The Scandinavians and Britain did. That they basically blocked it. So therefore, this defeat, of course, meant that European federalists had to go elsewhere. And in parallel with this, you have the Marshall Plan that the United States launched in 1947. That was both in response to an increasingly difficult situation with the Soviet Union over Eastern Europe, but also a catalyst for the opening of the Cold War in many ways. And within the Marshall Plan, there was this idea of European integration from the American administration, that you could actually unite Western Europe under American leadership by creating a monetary union, common market within 4 years. That was the plan, very bold plans. And then you would have a United States of Europe. And there, of course, the idea that this could also go federalist, but in the beginning, it had to be based on the Marshall Plan with economic cooperation within what would be created as the OEEC, the Organization of European Economic Cooperation. So around 1950-51, you have a very fluid situation where the Council of Europe and the European Federalists attempt to hijack the agenda had failed, where the OEC were beginning to make plans for European trade liberalization after the crisis of the 30s, and where the US actually wanted Britain to take the leadership. Britain would not take the leadership because they had trade preferences with the Commonwealth countries since the early 30s. They'd have been a crisis response.
Because we have to understand the United Kingdom as not as an island, but as an empire.
As an empire, yeah. And therefore, they rejected the American idea because they did not want to do trade liberalization in a manner that could lead to a customs union. The European countries, you could not be in a customs union. It's just the Brexit dilemma. Back then, it was already there. You cannot be in a customs union and then do individual trade agreements with other states. That's just how it is. And therefore, Britain rejected. So France actually, the United States then went to France and said, could you take an initiative? And there, Robert Schuman, the French foreign minister, and his kind of key advisor, Jean Monnet, who was leader of the French modernization plan and an institution called the Commissariat du Plan, he was given the task to develop a proposal. And here he came up with an idea that had been floating around among the Christian democratic parties of the 6 original states behind the European Coal and Steel Community, that a lot of the trouble between France and West Germany revolved around coal and steel, that were really the centers, the key sectors of the economy, but also the sectors of the economy that were would underpin any kind of rearmament. And therefore, some sort of it had to be found there. You had
still the time period when the relations between Germany and France are quite tight. I remember that General de Gaulle even had a speech where he said that there will be Allemagne in plural. So the Germany will be split into the countries or the regions, not remaining as a united Germany.
Of course, that's always been a French dream, and particularly on the right wing in France, both after the First World War and the Second World War. But in the end, of course, Germany ended into 2 states around 48, 49. It will be too much to go into that, but you ended with a split Germany with an Eastern German and West German state that were independent in 1949. And so the dilemma for the French was that with an independent West German state, even though it was not fully sovereign, it really wanted to be able to produce the coal and steel it needed, and it wanted to rebuild. And that meant that partial Allied control of West German coal and steel production would be removed, and French coal and steel production would be threatened by a West German resurgence, and that could undermine French modernization plans. So Monnet and Schuman, they actually found out that why don't we Europeanize coal and steel, save the French modernization plan, and relaunch European integration in a common framework. And that was the idea. And they sold it to Adenauer, who accepted it and found that it was a great idea, also because the idea was to treat West Germany as an equal member state, not have any kind of discrimination. And at that time, we have to understand West Germany were not fully sovereign. And they were not fully sovereign for many years into the 50s and early 60s, I would even say. So we have to understand that for West Germany to be treated on equal footing, it was really unique. So they negotiated the Treaty of Paris, that where the Schuman Declaration had a very clear kind of federal objective. The concrete plan that Monnet devised was actually very, very different. It was much more inspired by, for example, the Tennessee Valley High Authority that regulated the waters of the Tennessee River in the United States, or it was inspired by different experience that the League of Nations had done in economic intervention in other states. So it was based about this idea that Monnet had, that he would create a high authority with him as president, basically, of experts, and they would basically rationalize coal and steel sectors, more or less unimpinged by any other kind of political authority. So what happened
on the other hand, it would be technical body without political powers.
Exactly. But in the preparatory phase, first there was a French socialist the name escapes me right now, that convinced Monet to put in some sort of parliament for legitimacy. But we have to remember, this doesn't mean it's federalist, because many international organizations developed in the post-war years have parliaments. NATO has a parliament, for example. The Western European Union has a parliament. So to have assemblies, as they would be called, for international organizations were not particularly unique. However, when the proposal met the Benelux countries and West Germany and Italy for the negotiations, they were all keen to limit the powers of the high authority, because they thought this is a crazy plan. You cannot have a kind of all-powerful administrative unit there that kind of rules over the fate of coal and steel sectors in our economy. That's going way beyond what we can accept. So they invented a council of ministers with national governments where they would have influence over what the high authorities would do. They limited the high authority to be an administrative body. They made a very careful plan in the treaty to have a treaty that basically very outlined the different steps that the high authority could do and should do to regulate the sectors. And they created a judicial body to control the legality of what the high authorities did. And in the end, of course, you could argue, were this a blueprint for a future federation? Perhaps, perhaps not. It was really a mix between different traditions. It was a treaty of international law. The court that was devised were more a French administrative court than anything else, but it also had traits of being an international court. The high authority, what was that? That was a new supranational administrative kind of technical organization, very difficult to see. Was it an executive? Maybe, maybe not. The Council of Ministers was, of course, a permanent member state representation in an international organization. So there were different kind of different construction here that made it a very complex. And of course, the assembly did not have direct elections. It was a double mandate from national members of parliaments that would participate annually, a couple of times a year, in the assembly of the Coal and Steel Community. So this meant basically that for the European federalists, this was not particularly a success, but it was.
In legal words, some nasty legal words, I would say it's something sui generis. It's not a federation.
Oh, exactly. And I think if we just to give a short description of the debate, you can say the legal debate in the 50s about what this actually was. I think it was very open-ended what it was and what it would be. But you would see coalescing around the European institutions, particularly the high authority and its legal service, you would have key legal figures, such as Michel Gaudet already, who was part of the legal service of the high authority from 53 to 58, but also others who would argue that this was potentially a federation. It could develop into it. It had a federal aim, according to them, and therefore the court also should take the responsibility of the European Supreme Court. It should be said that Walter Hallstein, already in the negotiations of the treaty, had this idea, but it just didn't really materialize, even though, of course, arguably, firms could take the higher authority to court, and under international law, that was quite a unique kind of mechanism, that firms would actually be able to act without their governments in this kind of legal community. But nevertheless, when the lawyer, and there were also a number of legal scholars, more federalist inclined, that would argue this is how we should interpret this organization. But when these legal experts and institutional players, they met national communities of lawyers or international law professors, they were ridiculed. They were saying, "No, but this is just a political game you have there." You know, the Coal and Steel Community is basically a very particular sort of international organization, and also at the national, among national lawyers, it was really laughed at. So the key here is that very few lawyers and legal experts actually had these views, right, in the legal debate when we look at it before 1958. However, you can say what happens then is that the Korean War breaks out in 1950, I think it is. And therefore, France takes a second initiative. Again, Monnet is a key player. He develops a plan for a European defense community. And
This is much more federalist oriented.
Exactly, because René Pleven, he proposes this, the French defense minister, and again, West Germany accepts to negotiate it with the other members of the European Golden Steel Community. So while they are negotiating the Treaty of Paris, they begin to negotiate the Treaty of the European Defense Community.
So those two projects are parallel.
Yeah, and this project is incredibly sensitive, because you can imagine, would you have generals on the German side, for example? Would you have a German Wehrmacht again? Of course, that was unthinkable so few years after the war. I think it's hard to imagine how it must have felt. And therefore,
a lot of people who are actually affected by these plans were shooting to each other like just a few years ago.
Yeah. And would you have key generals of the Wehrmacht that would be part of the European defense community? Of course, so the answer was to discriminate against West Germany. And the negotiations lasted more or less 2 years. The French were very much supported by the Eisenhower administration in this, who saw it as a solution for European rearmament, and particularly West German rearmament. And I said it started with the Korea War, but then, of course, what the US did were demanded that West Germany should rearm. And then they had to create some sort of European defense community. So the negotiations were very much about how much you would discriminate against West Germany, right? That was what at stake. And then during those negotiations, the governments kind of ended up agreeing that you could not have a European defense without some sort of political leadership of that defense community. And therefore, they asked the Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community that had just convened in 1952 to actually act as an ad hoc body that would draft a treaty on a European political community.
So people who were delegated to deal with coal and steel industries were mandated to draft the European political project.
We have to remember that these were national parliamentarians who had double mandate.
Sure.
They were members of national parliaments.
But I can imagine that somebody who is elected for this body, he will be expert in industry and economical issues, while...
Not necessarily, because but again, you have to distinguish between the high authority that had this technical outlook and the Assembly of the European Coal and Steel Community that were really based on double mandates of national parliamentarians. So therefore, the president of the Assembly was Belgian socialist Paul-Henri Spaak. And Spaak, he then led this work, and they created a European political community that were really, I would say, even today, it would be a step forward, right, towards a federal kind of entity. It had two chambers, a state chamber and a directly elected parliament. It included human rights explicitly. It created a European Supreme Court that would handle human rights as well as the constitutionality of the community built. But of course, it was only ready, I think, sometime in 1953. And the Treaty of the European Defense Community by then had been done. And then the question was, could it go through parliaments? And here we have the dilemma, because in several of these states, the pro-European majority in parliament were actually not that broad. There were a lot of critical voices about this. It was not like everybody was gung-ho federalist at all. So in France, the Christian Democratic Party had, for different reasons, they had lost election after election after election. And by 1953, 1954, the majority to actually vote through a European defense community. And this meant that governments, when they received the treaty on the European political community, they began to negotiate it. And I think we should probably, if they had been doing that to the bitter end, I think we should have expected to see some of the wild, more federalist kind of elements being narrowed down or cut away. So I'm not saying that the full treaty would actually have gone through as the ad hoc assembly of the groups and the ECSC proposed it. But in the end, in the summer of 1954, the French from the Radical Party, Mendes France, Prime Minister, he made an agenda saying, should we vote about the EDC treaty? and there was a resounding no. The communists and the Gaullists came together with other members of parliament that they rejected to even vote about. So that meant basically that by September 54, you would have a European coal and steel community that had begun working, but you would have lost all these grander plans.
Mm-hmm.
And remember the Federalist defeat in the Council of Europe in 48, 49. This meant you ended up with a quite narrow economic, technical community with these, as you said, sui generis institutional setup that may or may not have a Federalist objective, but where you could say, let's say it in this way, if the coal and steel community were important enough politically for the member states to function as a kind of starting point for a process of federalization, then maybe in theory, this was something that would happen. But that is assuming that the community were important enough politically. And I don't think by the mid-1950s that it actually was, because for different reasons, the market for coal internationally ended up being much more, creating much lower prices for coal. And that helped French steel production. That was really one of the problems they were facing in 1950. France, right? And because the international market developed for that, a lot of interest in creating an efficient European market disappeared.
Mm-hmm.
So the European coal and steel community politically, also institutionally, were not considered very much a success by 1955. And that's also why the president, Jean Monnet, actually withdrew, because he sensed that this was not the framework that could kind of promote the integration process. And then you can say, of course, with the withdrawal of Jean Monnet as president for the high authority in 1955, there was this clear signal that the European coal and steel community would not really be the framework. It was not the dynamic kind of framework for the integration process that everybody really thought it could be. And you could also say in certain ways that the support for federalization of Europe or even supranational integration were weakening in many states. It was much more debated and much more unclear how far Europe would actually go in terms of integration. So you have different kind of developments in the mid-1950s that then nevertheless would create certain kind of basis for a new European initiative. On the one hand, you had still the OEEC, the Organization of European Economic Cooperation, that had been created by the Americans as part of the Marshall Plan. Or the Europeans had created it, but they were asked to kindly by the Americans, unless they didn't want to receive any Marshall funds. They had to be member of that. And within the OEEC in the early 50s, they created two key initiatives. First, they began to liberalize trade, not remove tariff, but liberalize trade from quantitative restrictions. That really was a plague for the development of trade between West.
Mm-hmm. So for the listeners, basically the quotas that, for example,
yes.
You could not, export your cars to other country because the other country would be protecting its
Exactly.
industry.
It's hard to imagine, right? But states would have ministries that would decide how many items you would import a certain category of goods. So it may be you would have a ministry that would say, oh, we don't like jazz records in the 50s. We only want to import classical records, for example. And then you couldn't buy jazz records in your country. Mm-hmm. So that's quantitative restrictions. Of course, you can imagine how much they hamper any kind of dynamic development of trade. But of course, so in the end, the liberalization of trade was really key here. But of course, for many of the smaller economies like the Netherlands and Scandinavians that had very open economies already by the 1950s and had a big part of the GDP that were trade, they were interested also in removing the tariffs barriers that were very high, particularly for some of the bigger European countries. So that was one kind of thing that the OEEC had been doing. Then the second initiative was that they created a European Payment Union, where they basically made, with the help of US financing, they made currencies convertible within each other. So the Europeans could actually they didn't have to balance payments between each other in currencies. They could actually convert it in the European Payments Union. And it's only in 1958 that European European economies are strong enough that they can make their currencies convertible with the US dollar. So the European Payments Union in the 50s are absolutely crucial for the German Wirtschaftswunder, the German high economic West German growth that becomes kind of a locomotive of growth in Western Europe in the 1950s. And the OECD provide that framework, the liberalization of trade, plus the European Payments Union that underpin that growth.
I mean, for example, this financial transaction, it's something completely imaginable today because our listeners will be listening us probably on Spotify or Apple Podcast, and I'm not sure whether it's a company which is seated in your country and you can pay your monthly payments to listen without advertisement. And it's just using your card and that's it. And it was impossible in 50s.
And it's such a different world. But of course, what it means is that you have, so to sum up, right, you have an OEC that is actually a framework for the rest of the economies of those Western European states, where the ECSC, the Cold Steel Community, is a limited community between only 6 continental states and only dealing with coal and steel. So the OEC is actually taking care of the broader market and the broader range of products, even though agriculture were mostly handled nationally, because there was so much protectionism around the agricultural sectors. So in the mid-1950s, because of, let's say, the lack of dynamic, what you begin to see is, for example, France and West Germany talking about bilateral trade agreements. Mm-hmm. And for the Benelux countries, this sounds like the interwar period. This sounds like a catastrophe coming, that you abandon multilateralism and then the big states can make very good agreements with each other, but the smaller state will suffer, just like Britain does vis-a-vis the EU today. Mm-hmm. The smaller states always have to give to get trade negotiations with bigger states because they have bigger markets. So therefore, the Benelux countries were really interested in taking an initiative, and what actually comes out of their negotiations in 55 is a double initiative. On the one hand, Jean Monnet had been doing a lot of lobbying where he thought, okay, coal and steel, that didn't work, but then why don't we make a community about nuclear power?
The energy of 20th century instead of energy of 19th century, which is the problem.
He and many other people at the time were very impressed by nuclear power. They thought it would be all dominant, and therefore to base a European integration process on nuclear power cooperation seemed to be a great idea. Also, it was perhaps the topic where the French most wanted to cooperate. They had, by the mid-50s, decided to create their own nuclear weapon. They lacked the financing to make this technological jump, and there West Germany could step in a European community about nuclear power. So therefore, Monnet convinced the Belgian now foreign minister, Paul-Henri Spaak, who had been president of the assembly negotiating the European political community, but now he was foreign minister of Belgium, to actually bring this proposal to the table. From the Netherlands came this other idea. The Netherlands had one of these countries like the Scandinavians that had very open economy and that were interested in pushing trade liberalization, not only to handle trade restrictions, but also tariffs. Mm-hmm. So therefore, the Dutch foreign minister, Beyen, he proposed that Europe should create, or 6 countries should create a common market. And a common market, that would be a customs union where you would dismantle tariffs internally, and you would create a common tariff wall around the market, and therefore also a common trade policy towards the outside. And these 2 plans were then brought together in a Benelux proposal. They were discussed by all the countries of the European Coal and Steel Community, and Britain was even invited for the discussions in the beginning. The first meeting was at the Messina Summit in 1955 in Sicily. And they couldn't really agree for anything because France didn't really want the common market. They didn't want that. Any ideas that the communities would be supranational was completely out of question because of the defeat of the European defense community. Nobody believed that French parliament would ever vote for any kind of supranational community again.
So it would be just another international organization as UN.
Yeah, probably. And also West Germany, there Adenauer was much more careful now after he had supported the foreign minister and Walter Hallstein, who led the foreign minister, with a constitutional approach to European integration. He had been disappointed by the defeat of the European defense community and actually now was somewhat more pragmatic. And for West Germany, the problem was that they did not really want Euratom. There they wanted to cooperate with the Americans, which was better technologically, and it would be much cheaper. And the common market, yeah, maybe, but the common market, the biggest West German export around in the mid-1950s, the biggest West German market was Scandinavia. It was not France or Italy. Scandinavia would not be part of this common market. So the common market was not the ideal trade solution for West Germany. That would have been a broad free trade area where you would remove tariffs, but not create a customs union with two big, very protectionist economies such as Italy and France. So therefore, they couldn't really agree. So they created a committee.
So basically, it was not in interest of anybody. Nobody wanted.
Not really. And then yet, there were, of course, politicians and civil servants that wanted this. Italy, particularly, supported it. Belgium did, the Netherlands did, Luxembourg, I think, were more on the fence. And then France and Germany, West Germany had their kind of dilemmas and challenges. But what they did was they created a committee to create a proposal, a plan, that would take its basis in these discussions. And again, our friend Paul-Henri Spaak became the head of the committee. And they negotiated until May 1956, and in the end presented the so-called Spaak report. And that is a report that was accepted in the May 1956. And then they created an intergovernmental conference to draw up two treaties that would be based on these proposals about a nuclear community and a common market. But before we start discussing those negotiations, what happened from the Messina summit in the mid-summer of 1955 to the early summer of 1956? Why did this actually change, right? Why were negotiations initiated? I think there we have to look both at France and West Germany, because the other countries would go along. In particular, if negotiations were launched, you would have to be part of it, right? Britain, yeah, they were there for the first meetings. They were even observer status in the Spaak committee for some months, but in the end they pulled out because they didn't want to be part of a common market. They didn't want to be part of customs union. But they were also very clear inside the British administration that if this actually succeeded, which was highly unlikely, then they might have to join pretty quickly afterwards for economic reasons. So what happened in France was that there was a parliamentary election in January 1956, and there, very surprisingly, the socialists won. And very surprisingly also, the French president, now we're talking here about the Fourth Republic, so it's a much weaker job, the French president at the time, much more ceremonial job. But the president still had the task to appoint the negotiator of the parties after the election for creating a new government. And he very surprisingly did not point at Mendes France, that was everybody's favorite, the guy who had put the European defense community for a vote in the summer of '54 and would surely not be a very good thing for European integration. Instead, he pointed at Guy Mollet, who was a socialist leader, who was a pro-European, and both the French president at the time and Guy Mollet were closely related to Monet. And so there you basically have a European kind of ideological element playing into the selection of the French prime minister. And Mollet sets up a government which is thoroughly pro-European. He brings back Robert Massillon, who had been General Secretary of the OEC, so really was a high-ranking, super influential economist in the Europe of the 1950s. And he becomes the chief negotiator. And he basically picks ministers who are all pro-European. For Molé, this is super complex because while Euratom, the nuclear project, can be sold in France, both French industries and French agriculture were very hesitant about the common market. They feared competition of German industries. And also we have to remember at this time in 56, 57, France is increasingly part of a very, very difficult Algerian war, colonial war, that occupies most of the time of the government. And in the end, you know, the government falls and they have almost a revolution and a coup, a right-wing coup for a French dictatorship. And they are saved in a way by inviting de Gaulle to create a new government in 1958 and set up a new constitution that becomes the Fifth Republic of France with a very strong position of president as the leader of France. So the Fourth Republic dies in 58 and de Gaulle takes power in 50. So the crazy thing, if you like, is that at the end of the Fourth Republic, they still negotiate the Treaties of Rome that becomes a European framework for French power in the many decades ever since. So basically, Massillon and Molé, they make a tough sell for French industries and agriculture and convince them gradually over the spring of 56 that negotiations can be started. And they create a French negotiating position that you can see traces of in the Treaties of Rome. They basically argue that we need to harmonize how many hours you work a day. You need to look at equal salary between the sexes. You can already, maybe you can think about the treaty articles, Michael, right? That where
I'm thinking about that because a lot of people are claiming that the EU is a kind of socialist project, and maybe a bit confirming that.
I don't think so. I think it's very much a capitalist project. But these few articles.
But you can see the roots of social laws in European integration already in the beginning, right? Like working hours, equal payment.
It was very rudimentary for many reasons, but I think in the Treaties of Rome, they are basically there as French negotiating demands.
And also, if I'm not mistaken, also a work week is set up in EEC treaty because Germans had 6-day long working week, while the French had 5, and it would be impossible to sell it to French people that they will have to work 1 day more. Yeah. Because of EEC.
It's true. So, and that also goes for holiday legs. So basically, these French demands are created in a way to signal to the French industries and to the public that we are going to get some social harmonization so we can compete in the common market against West German industries. But the French negotiators knows that, let's see how many of these are actually carried out. In the end, French industries turn out to be so competitive in the 60s. They are the main winner in the 60s in terms of creating additional exports for reasons I'll come back to. So many of these clauses are never carried through the Council of Ministers in the 1960s. They are basically ignored. And some of them, like equal pay, is brought back by the Court of Justice, of course, in the mid-1970s. So basically, you know, in the end, they were not so influential politically. But here in the Treaties of Rome negotiations, they were. So Molé and Massillon, they create this negotiating position with social demands of harmonization in order to be sure that France can actually compete. And there's also a lot of negotiations about when you go from the first tariff dismantlement to the second phase, that France would have an opt-out, basically, if they cannot compete. And in the end, they negotiate a communitarian model for how to handle it instead of basically a French right for a veto. But that's part of a very complex set of negotiations. And then, of course, Euratom, France were in support of that, but it's very, again, it's so complex. I won't go into that, to be honest, because it deals with the extent to which Molé government was first against Euratom as a tool for the nuclear weapon in France. And in the end, he ended up embracing that after the spring of 56. So he started being against it, that Euratom could be a tool for nuclear weapon building, and then over the summer of '56, he's actually in favor of that.
Dear listeners, now we will make a pause. Don't worry, we'll be soon back, and in the next episode, we will discuss, for example, how Germans nearly got a nuclear weapon. So stay tuned.
Cink, 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 dostali jste se na konec epizody a moc děkujeme za to, že jste nás poslouchali až do konce.
Určitě nám dejte like, určitě nás odebírejte a budeme se na vás těšit při příštím díle.
A pokud se vám díl líbil, pošlete nám zpětnou vazbu, pošlete nám to na e-mail z evropy@perfecciony.cz, pošlete to svým známým, hoďte si to do storíčka na Instagramu, cokoliv, budeme za to moc rádi, jak se to dostane co k největšímu množství lidí, které by to mohlo zajímat.
Děkujeme, mějte se hezky.